The knocking comes from inside the hull. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 knocks, then silence. Crew members have heard it for decades, always from the same spot, always in the same rhythm, always from a section of the ship where no one could possibly be. The knocking comes from the other side of the steel plates, from the water side, from outside the ship itself. But there is no one there. There cannot be anyone there. The Queen Mary is docked permanently in Long Beach, California, and has been since 1967. Nothing lives in the water beneath her hull. Nothing should be knocking, but something is. The pool closed years ago. The water was drained, the tiles dried, the doors locked against visitors who might hurt themselves in the empty basin. But staff members still hear splashing at night. They hear laughter, the high-pitched giggling of children playing in water that no longer exists. They see wet footprints leading from the pool to the changing rooms, footprints that appear on dry tile and fade within minutes. 2 women drowned in that pool decades apart. Their names were Jackie and Sarah. Guests on ghost tours sometimes see them, still playing in the water, still swimming in a pool that has been empty for years. Door 13 in the engine room is welded shut now. It has been since the 1960s, since the last death, since the ship decided that particular door had claimed enough lives. The door is a watertight hatch, massive and heavy, designed to seal compartments in case of flooding. It weighs thousands of pounds and moves on hydraulics that can crush anything caught in its path. At least 2 men died in that doorway, caught by the door as it closed during drills, their bodies broken by the weight of the steel. One was just 18 years old. Staff members see him still, a young man in work clothes walking the engine room where he died, sometimes appearing so solid that new employees try to speak with him before he vanishes. This is the Queen Mary, once the most elegant ocean liner in the world, now a floating hotel permanently moored in Southern California, and by many accounts the most haunted ship in America. For over half a century, guests and staff have reported encounters they cannot explain. Apparitions in period clothing, voices calling from empty rooms, objects moving on their own, cold spots that drift through corridors like invisible passengers still walking the decks. The ship has been investigated by paranormal researchers from around the world, featured on dozens of television programs, studied by scientists and skeptics alike. The phenomena continue regardless of who is watching. The Queen Mary is not merely haunted. She is a floating museum of death, a vessel that has accumulated tragedy across 8 decades of service. Drownings and crushings, wartime casualties and peacetime accidents, perhaps even murders in the dark corners of her lower decks. The ship carried soldiers to war and brought refugees to safety, and transported the wealthy across the Atlantic in unimaginable luxury. She saw death in all its forms, and something of that death seems to remain, trapped in the steel and wood of a ship that has become a monument to the persistence of the past. How did the most luxurious ocean liner ever built become the most haunted ship in America? What happened in the pool, in the engine room, in the countless spaces where tragedy struck and lives ended? Who are the ghosts that walk her decks, and why do they remain on a ship that no longer sails, moored to a dock in California 10,000 miles from the waters where they died? This is the dark story of America's most haunted ship, the Queen Mary, where the voyage never ends. If you find value in investigations of haunted places and forgotten history, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments which location to explore next. Your engagement makes these detailed investigations possible. Thank you for being here. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the ghosts, before the deaths, before the Queen Mary became a floating haunted house. The 1930s were the golden age of ocean travel. The airplane existed but was not yet practical for transatlantic crossings. If you wanted to travel between Europe and America, you went by ship, and if you had money, you went in style. The great ocean liners of the era were floating palaces, monuments to engineering and luxury that competed for the prestige of carrying the world's elite across the sea. The competition was fierce and international. Britain, France, Germany, and Italy all poured resources into building ships that would demonstrate their industrial might and attract the lucrative transatlantic passenger trade. The ships became symbols of national prestige, their speed and size and elegance matters of patriotic pride. When a new liner captured the Blue Riband, the prize for the fastest Atlantic crossing, it was front-page news around the world. Britain and France and Germany raced to build the largest, fastest, most elegant ships ever seen. The liners bore names that became legendary: the Normandy, the Bremen, the Rex, the Conte di Savoia. They were symbols of national pride, advertisements for the technological prowess of the nations that built them. The French Normandy was considered by many to be the most beautiful ship ever built, her interiors a showcase of Art Deco design. The German Bremen was among the fastest, holding the Blue Riband with a speed that seemed impossible for a vessel of her size. And in 1930, the Cunard Line of Britain laid the keel for a ship that would surpass them all. She was known during construction only as Hull No. 534, a secret project in the shipyards of Clydebank, Scotland, on the banks of the River Clyde, where British shipbuilding had flourished for generations. The yard employed thousands of workers: welders and riveters, electricians and carpenters, engineers and laborers, all dedicated to building the largest ship Britain had ever attempted. The Great Depression had devastated the global economy, and work on the ship was suspended in December 1931 when Cunard ran out of money. The half-finished hull sat on the slipway, exposed to Scottish weather, a monument to ambition interrupted by economic catastrophe. For 2 years, Hull 534 remained unfinished, and the workers who had been building her joined the ranks of the unemployed. The sight of the unfinished ship became a symbol of the Depression itself, evidence of economic failure and industrial decline. The British government eventually provided a loan to complete the ship, on the condition that Cunard merge with its rival White Star Line, the company that had owned the Titanic. The merger was controversial. White Star had never fully recovered from the Titanic disaster, but the loan was necessary. The merger was completed, and work on Hull 534 resumed in April 1934. The ship would be named Queen Mary, after the wife of King George V, and she would be the largest and most elegant ocean liner Britain had ever produced. The Queen Mary was launched on September 26, 1934, with Queen Mary herself presiding over the ceremony. Over 200,000 people gathered in Clydebank to watch the launch, the largest crowd the city had ever seen. The Queen spoke briefly, expressing her hope that the ship bearing her name would be a living symbol of the vigor and purpose of the nation. Then the hull slid down the slipway into the Clyde River as thousands cheered, beginning a journey that would span decades and oceans and eventually end in a California harbor where she remains to this day. But that was all in the future. In 1934, the Queen Mary was simply the newest and greatest expression of British maritime ambition. The finished ship was staggering in scale. She was 1,019 feet long, longer than the height of the Eiffel Tower if laid on its side. She displaced over 80,000 tons fully loaded, heavier than any ship that had come before. Her 4 propellers, each weighing 35 tons, were driven by steam turbines that produced 160,000 horsepower. She could cross the Atlantic in 4.5 days, faster than any ship of her size had ever traveled. She could carry over 2,000 passengers in 3 classes: first, cabin, and tourist, along with a crew of more than 1,100. Her interiors were designed by the finest artists and craftsmen in Britain, featuring over 50 different types of wood from around the world, custom artwork commissioned from leading painters and sculptors, and decorative schemes that varied from Art Deco elegance in first class to comfortable functionality in tourist. The first-class accommodations were palatial. The main dining room could seat over 800 guests beneath a ceiling painted with a map of the Atlantic Ocean, the ship's daily position marked by a moving crystal model. The room was 3 decks high, with balconies allowing other passengers to observe the grandeur below. The Grand Salon featured the largest carpet ever woven in one piece, along with murals and sculptures commissioned from leading artists. The swimming pool was tiled in elaborate patterns, surrounded by changing rooms and observation galleries, a facility that would later become famous for different reasons entirely. The ship had libraries stocked with thousands of books, theaters showing first-run films, beauty salons, squash courts, and enough deck space for passengers to walk miles without retracing their steps. The Queen Mary entered service on May 27, 1936, departing Southampton for New York on her maiden voyage. She was an immediate success, attracting the wealthy and famous who wanted to cross the Atlantic in the finest style available. Movie stars and royalty, business tycoons and politicians, they all sailed on the Queen Mary, enjoying the luxury and prestige that only the greatest ocean liner could provide. The ship's passenger lists read like a who's who of the 1930s elite. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor sailed on her. Clark Gable, Elizabeth Taylor, Fred Astaire, Greta Garbo, they all crossed on the Queen Mary at one time or another. Winston Churchill made multiple crossings before and after the war. The ship was where the wealthy went to be seen, where business deals were made over dinner in the first-class dining room, where romances bloomed on the promenade deck, where the world's elite gathered in floating splendor. The crossing itself was an experience unlike anything available today. 5 days at sea, with nothing to do but enjoy the ship's amenities, dress for dinner, walk the decks, and watch the Atlantic pass by. The rhythm of shipboard life was leisurely and structured. Breakfast in your cabin or the dining room, a morning walk on deck, lunch, afternoon activities, tea, another walk, cocktails in one of the lounges, dinner in formal attire, dancing or entertainment afterward, and then to bed as the ship rocked gently on the waves. In August 1936, the Queen Mary captured the Blue Riband, the prize awarded to the ship making the fastest transatlantic crossing. She crossed from Ambrose Light to Bishop Rock in 4 days and 27 minutes, averaging over 30 knots faster than any ship had ever traveled the route. The Blue Riband was a matter of national pride, evidence of technological superiority, and the Queen Mary held it proudly until 1938, when the French liner Normandy briefly reclaimed it. The Queen Mary took it back, and the two ships traded the honor until war made such competitions irrelevant. The Queen Mary was at the peak of her glory when World War II began. In September 1939, she was docked in New York, having just completed a transatlantic crossing, when Britain declared war on Germany. Her future was suddenly uncertain. Britain was at war, and the great ocean liners were too valuable and too vulnerable to continue their peacetime service. German submarines were already hunting in the Atlantic, and a ship like the Queen Mary would be an irresistible target. The Queen Mary waited in New York for months while the government decided what to do with her. The decision was transformation. The Queen Mary would become a troop ship, her elegant interiors stripped and converted to carry soldiers across the oceans where German submarines hunted. The artwork was removed and shipped to warehouses for safekeeping. The fine furnishings were put in storage or simply discarded. The luxurious staterooms were gutted, their mahogany paneling and silk wallpaper replaced by bunks stacked 3 and 4 high, crammed so closely together that soldiers could barely turn over in their sleep. The ship that had carried 2,000 passengers in peacetime comfort would carry 15,000 soldiers in wartime necessity. The transformation was dramatic and brutal. The ship was painted gray from bow to stern, her elegant white superstructure disappearing under coats of naval camouflage, earning her the nickname Gray Ghost for her ability to appear and disappear in the ocean mists. Her speed, over 28 knots even fully loaded, was her primary defense against submarines, which could barely make 17 knots on the surface and far less submerged. She traveled without escort, relying on speed and unpredictable routing to avoid the U-boat wolf packs that terrorized the Atlantic. The strategy was simple, but terrifying. A submarine could only attack if it could get ahead of its target and lie in wait. A ship traveling at 28 knots covered so much distance so quickly that submarines simply could not keep up. The Queen Mary would leave port, sail at maximum speed on constantly changing courses, and arrive at her destination before any submarine could intercept her. The strategy worked, but it required the ship to ignore any distress calls, to steam past survivors in the water, to never stop for any reason, no matter what was happening around her. The Queen Mary carried over 800,000 troops during World War II, more than any other vessel in history. She traveled over 600,000 miles, crossed the Atlantic hundreds of times, brought American soldiers to Europe for D-Day, and brought them home again when the fighting was done. A single crossing might carry an entire division, 15,000 men packed into a space designed for 2,000, sleeping in 8-hour shifts because there were not enough bunks for everyone, eating in continuous mess hall rotations that ran 24 hours a day. Winston Churchill crossed on the Queen Mary multiple times, conducting war business in a suite that had been specially modified for his security. He reportedly loved the ship, appreciating her speed and the relative comfort she still offered compared to other means of transatlantic travel. He held strategy sessions in her staterooms, communicated with London via the ship's radio, and enjoyed her bars, which remained stocked even during wartime. Adolf Hitler reportedly offered a $250,000 bounty and Iron Cross to any submarine captain who could sink the Queen Mary. The reward was never claimed. Despite thousands of miles traveled through submarine-infested waters, despite carrying nearly 1 million soldiers who would have been devastating losses if killed, the Queen Mary was never successfully attacked. German submarines tried. There were close calls, near misses, moments when torpedoes passed just meters from her hull, but her speed saved her every time. But the Grey Ghost's wartime service came with a terrible cost. The ship was crowded beyond imagination, soldiers packed into every available space, sleeping in shifts because there were not enough bunks for everyone to lie down at once. Disease spread easily in such conditions: influenza, dysentery, respiratory infections that swept through the packed compartments. The food was institutional at best, thousands of identical meals served in endless rotation. The voyage that had once been a luxury experience became an ordeal to be endured, a necessary suffering on the way to the greater suffering of combat. Men died on those crossings. They died of illness and accident, of falls down ladders and equipment failures, and the random misfortunes that occur when 15,000 men are packed into a confined space for days at a time. Their bodies were buried at sea or stored in the ship's refrigerated compartments until arrival in port. The exact number who died aboard the Queen Mary during World War II is uncertain, but it numbers in the hundreds at minimum. And then there was the Curacoa. On October 2nd, 1942, the Queen Mary was carrying over 10,000 American soldiers toward Britain, sailing in a zigzag pattern designed to confuse submarine targeting. The zigzag was essential. A predictable course allowed submarines to calculate intercept points, to position themselves ahead of the target and wait. The zigzag made such calculations impossible, but it also made the ship's movements harder for her escorts to predict. The light cruiser HMS Curacoa was providing escort as the Queen Mary approached the Irish coast, sailing alongside the massive liner as protection against air attack. The Curacoa was a small ship compared to the Queen Mary, displacing only 4,200 tons to the liner's 80,000, but she carried anti-aircraft guns that could defend against German bombers seeking to sink the valuable troopship. What happened next remains disputed, the subject of naval inquiries and court cases that dragged on for years after the war. The Queen Mary was zigzagging according to protocol, her course changing at regular intervals to present an unpredictable target. The Curacoa was attempting to keep pace with the much faster liner, trying to maintain her position as escort despite the speed differential. Somehow their courses converged. Whether the fault lay with the Queen Mary's helm, the Curacoa's navigation, or simple miscommunication between the vessels was never definitively established. The Queen Mary's massive bow struck the Curacoa amidships, cutting the cruiser in half as easily as a knife through paper. The smaller ship simply disintegrated under the impact, her hull parting in two pieces that sank within minutes. The Queen Mary barely shuddered, her 80,000 tons of momentum carrying her forward with hardly any change in speed. Men aboard the liner felt a slight bump, heard a strange grinding noise, saw debris floating past the portholes before anyone understood what had happened. The Queen Mary did not stop. She couldn't stop. Standing orders prohibited troop ships from stopping for any reason in submarine waters. A stationary ship was a target, and 10,000 soldiers could not be risked to save dozens of sailors. The Queen Mary continued toward Britain, her bow damaged but intact, leaving the survivors of the Curacoa to be rescued by other vessels that would arrive too late for most. Of the 439 men aboard HMS Curacoa, only 101 survived. 338 sailors died, either killed instantly by the collision or drowned in the cold Atlantic waters as the Queen Mary sailed away. Many were trapped in the sinking halves of the ship, unable to escape as the ocean poured in. Others made it into the water but died of exposure before rescue vessels arrived. It was one of the worst maritime disasters of the war, and it was caused not by enemy action, but by an accident between Allied vessels. The survivors spoke of watching the Queen Mary steam away, her gray hull disappearing into the mist as they struggled in the freezing water. They had been sacrificed for the greater good, for the soldiers whose lives mattered more than their own, for the military logic that said stopping meant dying. Some understood the necessity. Others never forgave. The Queen Mary carried those deaths with her. Crew members began reporting sounds from the bow, from the area where the collision had occurred. Knocking, scraping, sounds that seemed to come from outside the hull, as if someone was trying to get in. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 knocks, then silence. The pattern was consistent, recognizable, impossible to explain by any normal cause. The sounds continued after the war, after the ship was refurbished, after she returned to civilian service. They continue to this day. Whether the knocking represents the sailors of the Curacoa, still trapped in the water, still trying to reach the ship that killed them, is a question that has no answer. But the timing of the sounds, always 3 knocks, always from the bow where the collision occurred, always in the same rhythm as men might use to signal for help, suggests a connection that is difficult to dismiss. The Queen Mary remembers the Curacoa. Something in her steel remembers those 338 sailors who died because she could not stop. The war ended, and the Queen Mary was restored to passenger service. The gray paint was stripped away, revealing the white and black of her peacetime livery. The artwork was retrieved from storage and reinstalled. The bunks were removed and the staterooms were refurbished, their mahogany paneling polished, their silk wallpaper replaced, their fixtures restored to pre-war elegance. She resumed transatlantic crossings in 1947, once again carrying the wealthy and famous between Southampton and New York. The post-war years were a time of recovery and celebration. The Queen Mary carried war brides to America, thousands of European women who had married American soldiers and were now crossing the Atlantic to begin new lives in a new country. She carried refugees from the devastation of Europe, displaced persons seeking a fresh start far from the continent that had been torn apart by war. She carried celebrities and royalty, business executives and tourists, all the passengers who had made the transatlantic trade profitable before the war. The ship had been changed by her wartime service in ways that went beyond the physical. Staff members who had served aboard her during the Gray Ghost years told stories of what they had seen. The crowding, the sickness, the deaths, the collision with the Curacoa. Some spoke of strange experiences even then, of figures seen in corridors where no one should have been, of sounds from compartments that were empty. Whether these experiences were genuine hauntings or the products of exhausted minds under tremendous stress is impossible to say. But the stories entered the ship's lore, passed from crew member to crew member, becoming part of the Queen Mary's identity. But the world had changed. The jet airplane was coming, and it would destroy the ocean liner business within 2 decades. Pan American World Airways inaugurated transatlantic jet service in 1958, flying passengers from New York to London in less than 8 hours. Why spend 5 days crossing the Atlantic, no matter how luxurious the accommodations, when you could fly in a fraction of the time? The great liners tried to adapt. They marketed themselves as floating resorts, emphasizing the experience of the voyage rather than mere transportation. They offered cruises to nowhere, sailings whose purpose was the journey itself rather than any destination. They cut fares and added amenities and did everything they could to compete with the speed and convenience of air travel. It was not enough. One by one, the ocean liners were retired or scrapped, unable to generate enough revenue to cover their enormous operating costs. The United States, the fastest ocean liner ever built, was laid up in 1969 and remains in Norfolk to this day, rusting at her pier. The France was sold to Norwegian Cruise Line and converted into a cruise ship. The Queen Elizabeth was sold repeatedly, finally ending up in Hong Kong Harbor where she burned and capsized in 1972. The Queen Mary made her final Atlantic crossing in September 1967. Cunard had tried everything to keep her profitable. Reduced fares, cruises, appeals to nostalgia. But nothing could save a business model that technology had rendered obsolete. The ship was purchased by the city of Long Beach, California, for $3.45 million, a fraction of what she had cost to build, but more than any other buyer was willing to pay. She would be converted into a hotel, restaurant, and tourist attraction, permanently moored in the harbor where she could be visited but never again sail. The final voyage was emotional for those who remembered what the Queen Mary had been. Passengers who had crossed on her in the golden age of ocean travel came for one last sailing, one last chance to walk her decks and dine in her restaurants and remember an era that was ending. Crew members who had spent careers aboard her said goodbye to the ship that had been their home. The Queen Mary arrived in Long Beach on December 9, 1967, never to sail again. The conversion was expensive and troubled. The Queen Mary had been designed as a working ship, her every system optimized for transatlantic crossings. Converting her into a stationary hotel required removing her propellers and propeller shafts, sealing the holes left behind, installing new plumbing and electrical systems that met California building codes, adding fire suppression systems and accessibility features, and all the other requirements of a modern hotel. The work took years and cost far more than the city had budgeted. The ship opened to the public in 1971, marketed as a unique hotel experience where guests could sleep in staterooms that had once carried royalty and movie stars across the Atlantic. The first-class dining room became a restaurant. The lounges became event spaces. The promenade decks became tourist walkways. The Queen Mary was no longer a ship in any functional sense. She would never sail again. But she retained the atmosphere of her ocean liner days. The Art Deco elegance that had made her famous, the sense of history that permeated her steel and wood. But something else was happening aboard the ship. Something that no business plan had anticipated. No renovation had caused, no owner could explain. The ghosts had arrived, or perhaps they had never left. The reports began almost immediately after the ship opened as a hotel. Guests reported strange experiences in their staterooms, objects moving on their own, voices heard through walls that should have been soundproof, the feeling of being watched by someone they could not see. They reported waking in the night to find figures standing at the foot of their beds, figures that faded when they reached for the light. They reported hearing footsteps in the corridor outside their rooms, footsteps that stopped at their door and then resumed, as if someone was checking on them before moving on. Staff members reported encounters in the lower decks, in the engine room, in the pool area, in the crew passages where tourists rarely ventured. They saw figures in period clothing, sailors and officers, passengers in evening dress, workers in overalls, walking corridors and climbing ladders as if still performing duties that had ended decades ago. They heard voices calling names, conversations in empty rooms, music from spaces where no radio played. The swimming pool became the most famous haunted location on the ship. The first-class pool had been one of the Queen Mary's showpieces, an elegant facility with tiled walls and Art Deco styling, surrounded by changing rooms and observation galleries where non-swimmers could watch the activity below. The pool was drained when the ship was converted to a hotel. Maintaining a swimming pool on a stationary ship was impractical and expensive, but the space was preserved as a historical exhibit. Its empty basin a reminder of the luxury that had once defined transatlantic travel. 2 women had drowned in that pool over the years. One during the ship's sailing days, a passenger who somehow found herself alone in the pool area at night and slipped beneath the water without anyone to help her. One after the conversion, when the pool was briefly reopened, a young girl who drowned despite lifeguards on duty, whose death led to the pool's permanent closure. Their names, according to the stories that grew up around the hauntings, were Jackie and Sarah. Staff members began seeing the women in the pool area, even though the pool had been drained and closed to visitors. They saw wet footprints appearing on the dry deck, leading from the pool to the changing rooms as if someone had just climbed out of water that no longer existed. They heard splashing and laughter, the sounds of swimming and playing from a pool that contained nothing but air. Some claimed to see the women themselves, one in a 1930s bathing suit, one more modern, still swimming in a pool that existed now only in their eternal present. The engine room accumulated its own ghosts. The massive machinery that had once driven the ship across oceans was mostly gone, removed during the conversion to make room for other uses, but the space retained its industrial character. Catwalks and ladders, pipes and gauges, the bones of what had once been the most powerful propulsion system ever installed on a passenger liner. The engine room stretched for hundreds of feet through the bowels of the ship, a cathedral of steel where men had worked in heat and noise to keep the Queen Mary moving at 28 knots through all weathers. The work had been dangerous even under normal circumstances. The steam turbines operated at temperatures that could cause severe burns. The moving machinery could catch clothing or limbs and pull workers into spaces that would crush them. The noise was so loud that communication was nearly impossible, leading to misunderstandings that could prove fatal. Men died in the engine room throughout the Queen Mary's career. Falls, burns, equipment failures, accidents that happened too fast for anyone to prevent. Daughter 13 was where the worst deaths had occurred. The watertight door, designed to seal the engine room in case of flooding, operated on hydraulics that could close with tremendous force. The doors were tested regularly, drilled so that crew members would know what to do in an emergency. During these drills, crew members had to pass through the doors quickly before they sealed. The timing was critical. Too slow, and you would be caught by the closing door, trapped in its massive weight. At least 2 men had failed to make it through door 13 in time. The door had caught them, crushed them, killed them in an instant of mechanical indifference. Their bodies had to be extracted from the twisted steel, their deaths investigated and documented, their families notified that their sons or husbands would not be coming home. One victim was John Petter, an 18-year-old fireman who was crushed by door 13 during a drill in 1966, just a year before the ship was retired. Petter was young, new to the ship, still learning the rhythms and dangers of life in the engine room. He was caught by the closing door, his body broken before anyone could help him. His death was one of the last aboard the Queen Mary during her sailing days, a final tragedy before the ship's career ended. Staff members see him still. A young man in work clothes walking the engine room where he died, appearing so solid, so real, that new employees sometimes try to speak with him, ask him questions, offer assistance before he turns a corner and vanishes. He walks the catwalks where he walked in life, inspects the machinery he was learning to tend, performs the duties he never finished. He is 18 forever, trapped in the moment before his death, unable or unwilling to move on. The other victim was crushed in a similar accident years earlier. The details are less certain, the records less complete. but staff members report seeing a second figure in the engine room, an older man who walks the catwalks and inspects the machinery as if still performing duties that ended decades ago. He wears the clothing of an earlier era, moves with the confidence of experience, knows the engine room in ways that only someone who spent years working there could know. The first-class suites had their own haunting. Room B340 became so notorious that the hotel stopped renting it to guests for years. The room had been the site of at least one death, a purser who was murdered there according to some accounts during the ship's sailing days. The exact circumstances of the death are unclear, the records either lost or deliberately obscured, but something happened in that room that left a mark. Guests who stayed in B340 reported violent disturbances, lights turning on and off, faucets running by themselves, blankets being pulled off beds by invisible hands. Some reported hearing voices, conversations that seemed to come from inside the walls. Some reported seeing a figure standing at the foot of their bed, watching them sleep, remaining visible for seconds that felt like hours before fading into the darkness. The reports were consistent across guests who had no connection to each other, who had not heard the stories before checking in, who experienced things they could not explain. The room was eventually taken out of service, used for storage, locked against the guests who kept requesting it, precisely because of its reputation. The haunting had made B340 both unmarketable and desirable. Guests were afraid to stay there, but they were also curious, drawn to the possibility of experiencing something supernatural. The hotel eventually found a way to capitalize on both impulses, reopening the room in recent years as a special haunted experience for guests who sign waivers and pay premium rates. The isolation ward was perhaps the most disturbing location. Deep in the ship, far from the tourist areas, there was a space that had once served as the ship's medical facility, where sick passengers were quarantined and where those who died at sea were kept until burial or arrival in port. Ocean liners were floating cities, and like any city, they experienced deaths. Passengers who succumbed to illness, who suffered heart attacks or strokes, who died of the various causes that can claim human life regardless of location. The ward was said to be haunted by the spirits of those who had died there, passengers who had succumbed to illness or injury during Atlantic crossings, their bodies stored in the cold room until the ship reached land. The cold room was a necessity on ships that might be days from port. Bodies had to be preserved, and refrigeration was the only practical option. How many bodies had passed through that cold room during the Queen Mary's career was uncertain, but the number was surely in the hundreds. Staff members reported feeling overwhelming dread in the isolation ward, a sense of presence that was hostile rather than merely strange. Some refused to enter the space alone, requiring company before they would go down to perform maintenance or retrieve stored items. Some refused to enter at all, choosing other jobs, accepting other duties rather than spending time in a space that felt wrong in ways they could not articulate. The ward was not part of any tour, was not open to guests, was simply a part of the ship that everyone who knew about it preferred to avoid. The reports multiplied over the decades. The Queen Mary was investigated by paranormal researchers from around the world, teams with electronic equipment and psychic mediums, skeptics and believers alike. Television shows filmed episodes aboard the ship. Ghost hunters, ghost adventures, Most Haunted, and dozens of others. The ship became famous not just as a historic vessel, but as one of the most haunted locations in the United States, attracting visitors who came specifically hoping to encounter something supernatural. The investigations produced evidence that believers found compelling and skeptics found unconvincing. Electronic voice phenomena, EVPs, recordings that seemed to capture voices that were not heard at the time of recording, were collected throughout the ship. Investigators would set up digital recorders in empty rooms, ask questions into the silence, and then find upon playback that something seemed to have responded. Some of these recordings are startling, clear words and phrases that appear to answer directly. Others are more ambiguous, sounds that might be voices or might be mechanical noise, the creaking of an old ship, the hum of electrical systems. Photographs taken on the Queen Mary have sometimes shown unexplained shapes and shadows, figures that appeared in images but had not been visible to the photographers, faces in portholes, shapes in corridors, forms that seemed to wear clothing from the 1930s or 1940s. Some of these photographs have become famous in paranormal circles, reproduced in books and documentaries as evidence of ghostly activity. Photography experts note that many such images can be explained by camera artifacts, reflections, long exposures, or other technical factors, but some images resist easy explanation. Temperature anomalies have been documented throughout the ship. Investigators with thermal imaging equipment have recorded cold spots that appear suddenly and move through rooms in ways that do not correspond to ventilation patterns or ocean drafts. Some cold spots are associated with specific locations: the pool area, the engine room, the corridor outside room B340, while others seem to drift through the ship like invisible passengers walking the decks. Electromagnetic fluctuations have been recorded as well. Investigators using EMF detectors have documented spikes and anomalies throughout the ship, readings that seemed to respond to questions, to increase when investigators asked spirits to make their presence known. The theory among paranormal investigators is that spirits require energy to manifest, and their presence creates measurable disturbances. Scientists note that old ships have complex electrical systems that can produce electromagnetic noise without any supernatural involvement. The ship embraced its reputation completely. Ghost tours became a major attraction. Guided walks through the haunted areas where guests could hear the stories and perhaps experience something themselves. The tours run nightly, led by guides who have memorized the history and the hauntings, who walk guests through the first-class pool and the engine room, and the most notorious staterooms. Special events are held throughout the year. Halloween brings extended ghost hunts, opportunities for guests to spend the night in the most active areas with paranormal investigation equipment. The Queen Mary has hosted seances in the first-class dining room, overnight investigations in the engine room, and countless private ghost hunts for serious researchers. Psychic mediums have walked her decks, claiming to communicate with the spirits that remain. Whether these events contact anything supernatural or simply provide entertainment is a question each participant must answer for themselves. The ship has become a case study in the relationship between history and haunting. She is a vessel with documented deaths, hundreds during wartime service alone, not counting peacetime accidents. She is a ship that witnessed trauma on a massive scale, that carried soldiers to war and brought home the wounded and the broken. If any place should be haunted, the Queen Mary has earned the distinction through the weight of her history. But what are these experiences really? Are they genuine encounters with the spirits of the dead, evidence that something of human consciousness survives death and remains attached to the places where life ended? Or are they something else? Psychological phenomena explained by suggestion and expectation. Artifacts of electronic equipment and photographic technology. The human brain's tendency to find patterns and meaning in random noise. The Queen Mary is a ship full of history, full of death, full of stories that would create expectations of haunting, even if nothing supernatural were occurring. Over 1,000 people died aboard her during World War II alone. Soldiers who succumbed to disease during crowded crossings, accidents in the engine room and on deck, and of course the 338 sailors of the Curacoa who were killed when the Queen Mary cut their ship in half. Add the peacetime deaths, the drownings, the accidents, the illnesses, the possible murders, and the total climbs into the thousands. A skeptic would say that any location associated with so much death would generate ghost stories, that human beings cannot help but populate such places with spirits and hauntings. The power of suggestion is immense. Tell people a ship is haunted, and they will hear footsteps in empty corridors, feel cold spots where drafts blow through old steel, see figures in shadows that are only shadows. A believer would say that the Queen Mary is different, that the consistency of the reports across decades, the specificity of the experiences, the sheer volume of encounters cannot all be explained by psychology and expectation. Something is happening on that ship that science cannot yet explain. The dead are still aboard, still sailing a voyage that never ends, still trapped in the steel and wood of a vessel that became their tomb. The truth, as always, is uncertain. The Queen Mary floats in Long Beach Harbor, a monument to an era of ocean travel that has passed, a museum of Art Deco elegance and wartime sacrifice, a hotel where guests sleep in staterooms that once carried movie stars and soldiers and ordinary people seeking new lives in new worlds. She is all of these things, and she may be something more. A vessel that has accumulated so much history, so much life, so much death, that the boundary between past and present has worn thin within her hull. The pool is empty but not silent. Door 13 is welded shut but not forgotten. The bow still bears the memory of the Curacoa, still echoes with knocking that comes from nowhere. The Queen Mary is haunted by her own history, by the weight of everything that has happened within her steel walls, by the thousands of lives that have passed through her and the hundreds that ended aboard her. Whether the ghosts are real in any objective sense matters less than what they represent. The Queen Mary is a ship that refuses to be forgotten, that insists on her own significance, that will not fade quietly into the obscurity that has claimed most of her sister ships. The Normandy burned and capsized, was scrapped for her metal during the war she never fought. The great German liners were sunk or seized as war prizes. Even the Queen Mary's sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, burned in Hong Kong harbor in 1972, a total loss. But the Queen Mary survives. Battered by financial struggles, threatened repeatedly with scrapping, she persists, moored to her California dock, welcoming visitors who want to walk her decks and sleep in her staterooms, and perhaps encounter something they cannot explain. She is the last of the great ocean liners, the final survivor of an age when crossing the ocean was a voyage of days rather than hours, when ships were floating cities carrying thousands of souls through waters that could be as dangerous as any battlefield. The ghosts, if they exist, are part of that persistence. They are the ship's refusal to let go of her past, her insistence that the lives lived aboard her matter, that the deaths that occurred within her hull have not been forgotten. Jackie and Sarah still swim in the first-class pool. John Petter still walks the engine room. The sailors of the Curacoa still knock on the hull, seeking entrance to a ship that killed them. They are the Queen Mary's passengers still, even though the ship no longer sails, even though the water has been drained and the engines have been removed and the Atlantic is 10,000 miles away. The Queen Mary is haunted. By ghosts or by memories, by spirits or by stories, she is haunted. She carries her past with her as surely as she once carried passengers, and that past will not let her go. It whispers in empty corridors, splashes in drained pools, knocks on steel plates from the wrong side. It watches from doorways and walks through engine rooms and stands at the foot of beds where guests try to sleep. Room B340 has been reopened in recent years, offered to guests brave enough to spend the night in what was once the most notoriously haunted room on the ship. The room has been renovated, its dark history incorporated into the experience, its reputation transformed from a liability into an attraction. Guests who stay there sign waivers acknowledging the room's history. Some report experiences, some report nothing but a good night's sleep. The room keeps its secrets. The pool remains empty, preserved as a historical exhibit, its Art Deco tiles dry and dusty, its changing rooms silent. Ghost tours pass through regularly, guides sharing the stories of Jackie and Sarah, pointing out the spots where wet footprints have been seen, where splashing sounds have been heard. Some tour guests claim to hear the sounds themselves, laughter, swimming, the echoes of lives that ended in that water. Others hear only the guide's voice and the creaking of an old ship. Door 13 is still welded shut, still sealed against the possibility of another accident, still marked by the deaths it caused. The engine room is open to tours, visitors walking the catwalks where John Petter walked, standing near the door that killed him, hoping perhaps to see the young man in work clothes who is said to walk there still. Some claim to see him. Most see only shadows and machinery. But the reports continue, year after year, decade after decade. The Queen Mary survives when so many of her sisters did not. The great ocean liners of the 1930s are almost all gone now. The Normandy burned and capsized in New York Harbor in 1942 was scrapped for her metal during the war she never fought. The Bremen was destroyed by fire in 1941. The Rex was bombed and sunk in 1944. The Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mary's sister ship, burned in Hong Kong Harbor in 1972. A total loss. Even the great post-war liners, the United States, the France, are rusting in ports or scrapped for their steel. But the Queen Mary persists. She has survived financial crises that threaten to send her to the scrapyard. She has survived hurricanes and earthquakes and the simple passage of time. She has survived the end of the era she was built to serve, the death of the ocean liner industry, the rise of jet travel that made her purpose obsolete. She floats in Long Beach Harbor, a monument to a vanished age, a museum of Art Deco elegance, a hotel where guests can sleep in staterooms that once carried kings and movie stars across the sea. And she is haunted by her history, by her dead, by the weight of everything that has happened within her steel walls. She remembers every crossing, every passenger, every death that occurred aboard her. She remembers the soldiers she carried to war and the sailors she killed in the fog. She remembers the women who drowned in her pool and the men who were crushed in her doors. She remembers it all, and she will not let it go. The Queen Mary, Long Beach, California. Permanently moored since 1967. Length, 1,019 feet. Displacement, 81,237 tons. Passengers carried in peacetime, over 2 million souls who walked her decks. Troops transported in wartime, over 800,000 soldiers who sailed to war and back. Deaths documented aboard, hundreds at minimum, perhaps thousands, when wartime casualties and the Curacoa disaster are included. Ghosts reported. At least 50 identified spirits, possibly many more that remain unnamed and unrecognized. She is the last of her kind, the final surviving example of the great ocean liners that once dominated transatlantic travel. Every one of her competitors has been scrapped, burned, sunk, or demolished. She alone remains, floating in her California harbor, preserved by her history and her hauntings, kept alive by the visitors who come to experience something that no longer exists anywhere else in the world. The voyage never ends. The passengers never quite disembark. The dead never quite leave. And somewhere in the ship, in the pool where Jackie and Sarah still swim, in the engine room where John Petter still walks, in the bow where the sailors of the Curacoa still knock, in room B340 where figures stand at the foot of beds, something is waiting. Something that remembers every crossing, every death, every tragedy that has marked this ship's long history. Something that will not leave, cannot leave, refuses to acknowledge that the voyage ended decades ago. The Queen Mary, America's most haunted ship, where the dead sail on forever. If this story mattered to you, please consider subscribing. These investigations take time to research and produce, and your support makes them possible. Tell me in the comments, have you ever visited the Queen Mary? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain? Which haunted location should we explore next? The ocean is vast, the dead are patient, and some voyages never reach their destination. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next investigation.